Hello, and you are very welcome to this week's episode of Cut Through the Noise with me, Aisling O'Rourke of thecommunicationscoach.ie. You are most welcome, and I hope you have been enjoying our special Cut Through the Noise series all around sustainability issues. The podcast is, of course, aimed at business leaders who want help and advice on elevating your brand's messaging and really helping you getting through to your target audience. And, you know, unless you've been under a rock, we all know that we have to become more sustainable and environmentally minded in how we conduct business going forward. And that's entirely separate to the moral case for it, because you may disagree with me that it's the right thing to do, but Irish and European regulations are going to, over the next couple of years, very soon, force every business owner, whether it's a global conglomerate or a solopreneur, we're all going to have to become more sustainable in how we do business, more transparent in how we do business. But that poses a lot of challenges, which is why I've decided to really focus this particular series of Cut Through the Noise on that topic. And one of the challenges it poses is accepting the changes and convincing others to make the changes along with you. So I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Eoin Galavan of Irish Doctors for the Environment, to talk us through the psychology of this challenge that we're all going to be facing. Eoin, you are very welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Eoin, talk to me first, for people who don't know what Irish Doctors for the Environment is. In a nutshell, what's the group hoping to achieve?
So I'm a psychologist, and I'm kind of with two groups. So I'll tell you a little bit about both. One is a special interest group with the Psychological Society of Ireland, whose goal is to bring addressing the climate environmental emergencies into public and political awareness. Thinking about why it is that we're stuck and how we might move ourselves forward, and what the barriers and enablers of all that might be. And the Irish Doctors for the Environment group, I'm a little bit more loosely involved with, but they're a fantastic advocacy group made up of medical and health professionals from all over the country, trying to bring awareness to the very serious health consequences of the climate crisis. So I'm kind of connected in with both of those groups.
And I think, like, there is, and while it's not the conversation we're going to have today, it should be said that there is a significant mental health issue and psychological issue when it comes to really understanding the scale of the climate situation and not allowing ourselves to become overwhelmed by that. But if for the purpose of today's conversation, we focus in on what we can do when it comes to making these changes and communicating these changes. I'm reminded, not too long ago, I spoke to a small business owner who has a team of about 6 or 7 all part-time staff. They're the only full-time, the owner is the only full-time member of staff in the team. And the complaint they were making to me was that the staff were not cleaning up the kitchenette properly or adequately to their standards. And I'm mentioning this because it all came down to communications. A conversation had not been had around the importance of hygiene in the workplace. The manager had assumed that, of course, they'd know that they need to clean up after themselves, like it's just good manners. But that conversation still needed to be had, because we all know we cannot make assumptions. And there's going to be a big piece for business owners, but anybody in the workplace really, around these changes that we're going to have to make, and really talking about the changes and understanding why we have to make these changes. And I imagine that for some people, that's going to be quite a difficult thing to navigate in the workplace.
Yeah, it's such a big question, isn't it?
Mm.
And it's almost dependent on how honest an organization and the leaders in the organization want to be about the reality of why we're doing this and where we are. And that has a consequence for how far the social norms of the culture and the behavioral ask, if you want, of the changes of the organization can go. So, treating the climate crisis as if it's, something out there for others to worry about. It's not really our bag. Well, we can do a little bit of tinkering around the edges. We can tighten up on our recycling a little bit, or have a cycle to work day once a month, or something that feels tokenistic,
Mm-hmm.
that is a pro-environmental behavioral change, but is not really substantive. And in the broader scale of the emissions or environmental impact of the organization is not really meaningful. And what that does is it communicates to people that this is an issue that is a kind of a luxury concern. We can take it a little bit seriously because there's a social value attached to it now. And we're all supposed to, quote unquote, have climate concerns on board. There's like a virtue signaling kind of moral rightness to it that we're all conscious of. And if you ask people, are you concerned about the climate? They'll all say, yes, very serious, very important. So that's one kind of lane of activity. And I think a lot of people are in that. By the way, I think we're all caught in this series of double binds, by the way. And if we allow in the reality of the climate crisis and the scale of the environmental emergency that we're in other words, we let ourselves know how serious it is for ourselves. And maybe that organizations start seeing it as a risk, and they look at it through that prism. And they start saying, well, we need to take this seriously, not just because I'm a human being who needs to live in a safe and stable environment, which you would imagine would underpin everything. It's kind of odd that you can offset that somewhere. Not only that, but the organization can see this through the prism of financial risk, and it can mobilize itself around that. Whereas mobilizing itself around the idea that society might be under threat and civilization might be under threat, and having food and a stable kind of food system around us might be under threat. It's very difficult for an organization to mobilize itself in response to that. So I think there's a real confusion and a great deal of uncertainty about how far along the spectrum of honesty organizations need to bring themselves, and what is the imperative around that? What are governments going to do to help organizations make those really important journeys? And then different industries will have different challenges. So it's not the same. The aviation industry and the agricultural industry, which are two that often come under the public spotlight, are very different than the retail sector or the fashion industry, and every industry will have its own set of challenges and dilemmas. And in a way that allows everyone to offset it to someone else. We focus on what we focus on, and our main goal is to sell this, that, or the other. And it's someone else's job to either set the regulations or to take on the concern of emissions reductions, because we're not going to do that, because that represents an existential risk to the function of the organization, making money, for example, for shareholders or whatever, however it might be articulated. So we have to be really honest about this, about how serious the problem is, how big the scale of it is. And organizations need to decide how honest are we going to be within our culture. And there's something really interesting happening where I think more and more people are starting to know how significant this is. And we all have this ability to know about it in one way and then not know about it. So we can have deep concerns about our children's future, for example. We can have deep concerns about having access to safe food and drinking water and a stable society. And we can see how under threat those things are. And then we can kind of not know it. Get into work mode, and you start acting in your role in that social context. Everyone's talking about it, and everyone's, kind of all of the energy and thinking is around your productivity within that context. And so it gets unknown for a period of time. And we can all do that. In fact, I would say we all have to be able to do that in order to survive in the world as it is right now, because it's very rare that a person would go into an organization where everyone is fully and consciously talking about the climate and environmental crisis and taking it seriously.
Is that because, you know, for want of a better way, when we go in, unless it's a new job or a new position, for most of us, when we go into work mode, whether that's a physical workplace or working from home, when we go into work mode, we have a certain way of doing things. And that's essentially habits, that we have certain habits formed, and that these changes may require us to make new habits, which is quite difficult. You know, like it might be, and I'm trying to think of a blatantly obvious example. Like most of us are used to saving data in the cloud, you know, and we always talk about, you know, the cloud is this thing off in the distance that we don't need to have to worry about. But really, in Ireland's case, the cloud is nearly City West. Like that's where most of the data centers are in the country. And like from the work that I've been doing and looking at how I can do my bit, I know I'm going to need to look at all my data and the amount of files that I have saved through the journalistic pattern of never deleting anything in case it may be needed. That in itself adds to the carbon footprint. So if I'm going out to maybe an event and I know for my own business, I need to be recording content and making videos and generating that information so that I can talk about it online, I know now that at some point I'm going to have to get into the habit of only holding on to the good photographs or maybe the good video and deleting the rest of the data and not saving it. And for me, in that really practical way, that will require me to form a new habit, which I think is one of the hardest things that we have to do as adults.
Yes and no.
Okay.
Or rather, yes, it can be hard, but not necessarily because our own behavioral change is the challenge. So I think what we're often missing in when we think about establishing new pro-environmental behaviors is the social context that those occur in. So for example, if you wake up in the morning and you go into work and there's new limits put in place on data usage, and there's leadership shown, and there's a set of values communicated about how important this is that we reduce the amount of data we're using because we're trying to X, Y, and Z. And then everyone operates around that. Behavior changes overnight. Mm-hmm. It's challenging to change your behavior in a context where data usage is seen as an inconsequential action. Because the social norm is, well, it's in the cloud, you know, this ethereal kind of sense of it's not really anywhere. And you can have as much data as you want. It doesn't really matter. That's never been seen as a limit we should be concerned about. So in the absence of a social norm that's kind of articulated through policy or some legal framework, for example, or with financial barriers, or even just general conversation in people, in the absence of those things, it's challenging to change our behavior. But when you put those things into place, it's actually not that hard at all. In fact, most people, if a new rule comes in and everyone's, you know, it's articulated in those kind of ways, people get on board pretty quickly. There's loads of examples of how we've proven ourselves to be capable of adapting ourselves and changing our behavior when there's certain ingredients put in play to facilitate that.
So then if you are listening to this podcast and you are a leader in that position, like I'm thinking about the smoking ban in workplaces when it came in, 2 decades ago now? You know, leaders would have had to say, like, especially in the hospitality sector, no, like staff are not allowed to smoke in the building, customers are not allowed to smoke in the building. There had to be a conversation around that. So then as leaders, how do we communicate that piece of change without causing ructions amongst our colleagues?
Well, it depends on what we're talking about and how much ructions are likely to be caused and how you know, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about, you know, people not being allowed to drive to work? And that has a huge implication for people who need to drop their kids off to school on the way to work and they don't have public transport. Or are we talking about, you know, we're removing all of the single-use printers from everyone's desk, and we're going to use a communal printer because that will reduce paper waste, and everyone just has to go along with it. So it really does depend on the scale of the change we're talking about. But some of I think from a leadership point of view, I think this is really important, actually, because in establishing new social norms, and there's an iterative, obviously, relationship between people and leaders and organizations as well. So it's not a single channel of activity only. But from the leadership point of view, becoming conscious of climate change, learning about it, and learning about the many aspects, because there's layers to this in all sorts of different facets. So one of the biggest aspects of an organization's climate footprint, if you want, or ecological footprint, is their money. Now, where do they do their banking? Where does their pension fund invest? So you might think, well, we're doing great because we're now recycling 20% more paper. But when you put that in comparison to the fact that a pension fund might be investing in an oil company, it withers in comparison in terms of its impact. So the leadership is really about doing that kind of due diligence on where is our biggest impact and where can we have the biggest impact, and then modeling that so that it kind of generates willingness. So I see that you've done your bit. You've taken this really seriously, and moving money around for a company might have some short-term implications for the value of that pension fund, for example. But in the longer term, you could actually make an argument that that's more secure. And it's demonstrating something really important. This is a real thing. It's not a luxury concern that we can all shelve permanently and pretend isn't happening. And that's currently what we're doing in a lot of cases. We're treating it as if it's something that is out there and everyone else can kind of take ownership of it. So from a leadership point of view, by far the most important thing that people can do is start learning and start talking about the issue and being honest about how consequential it is for the humans that work in the organization and also for the organization itself. So there isn't a person on the planet that's going to escape the consequences of climate change. And the moral imperative, if that's allowed in an organization, and some cultures will grab that and be friendly. Some might find that really challenging. Is do we play a part in protecting what we can protect for the survival of our society and safe and stable food and a place that doesn't flood and go into drought every 20 minutes? That kind of climate kind of chaos that we're starting to witness more and more of. Do we play a part in protecting ourselves from that, or do we continue to shelve it and continue deepening the problem by not doing what we could? So there's a real imperative there, and I don't think that's been fully grasped yet by many people. There's still some people who kind of think, well, it's okay to not care about this. This is, some people care about the rainforest, and isn't that nice? They're nice. That's good for them. Some people care about multiple sclerosis or other causes that need kind of attention, and that's good for them. But I don't have to care about this. I think some people actually still feel contented in that space, partially because they haven't yet been helped realize the consequences for them and their children, for example, their family. And there's a lot of that kind of, the term is disavowal. I can partially know, but then I'm going to let myself unknow happening. So organizations really need to grapple with that. And I'm not saying that that's an easy thing to do. I actually think it's a very, very challenging thing to do for leaders and organizations to take on board the ownership and the responsibility for what level of consciousness are we going to bring to this organization, and how are we going to talk about it, and how do we knit it into what we're trying to be as an organization as well? Those are very challenging questions.
How important is the language that an organization uses when they're discussing this? Because, there may be some members of the team that fervently believe that this is all nonsense, that this is, a conspiracy theory. And, and then on the other hand, you will have other members of the team that are already overwhelmed. And this might be something that just really has, we'd say in my family, adds icing to the cake, in terms of stress levels. So how important is our choice of language when we're discussing this and explaining why we need to make the changes, why we need to be more careful about the amount of data that we're storing, why in the staff canteen we have to now have a compost caddy. These changes, these practical changes, how important is that language piece?
It's hugely important. And it's a really interesting dilemma that you've put words on there. And I think the behavioral changes that you note are kind of at the end of the sequence. It's almost like the organization needs to go on a journey and bring people with it. And some people will stay in that position of denial and there's various reasons why that might be true. Some people stay in a position of denial, of threat to themselves, even when there's overwhelmingly obvious evidence that their life is in danger. So, for example, some people who struggle with smoking addiction will be told, you're going to die, and if you continue smoking, and they will kind of continue smoking, or alcohol addiction. And there's lots of other examples of how people get stuck in a sense. So we have to kind of allow that that's true, first of all, and not expect everyone to be uniformly conscious or willing to accept the reality of what's occurring. But that shouldn't, I also don't think that should make people fearful of moving forward with the conversation. It's a little bit like if you went to your doctor and you got a terrible diagnosis, and then you became fearful of looking at it again. Because it's awful, and the consequences of how you have to live your life have changed dramatically. And maybe it's in the post, it hasn't quite happened yet. So there might be a period where you're thinking, I really just don't want this to be true. And I can sit with that for a while. And I think some people are there. I don't want this to be true. This is a deeply uncomfortable thing to become conscious of. And the fact that we're all participating in it and kind of making it worse, in a sense, in varying degrees, is a deeply uncomfortable thing to become conscious of. So I think when people start that journey, they need to know that that's what they're going to encounter, that some people will be relatively open to it and need to have the conversation. In fact, some people are leaving organizations now because they won't have those conversations, or they're choosing to work in places because they are more pro-environmentally conscious, and there's almost like a mission cause attraction to some organizations. And people will be along that spectrum. So when you do start that conversation, it's really important to know some people are going to be fully aware of this and will be our champions and supporters, and some people will be resistant. I guess that's true anytime an organization tries to change, right? That's part of just working with people.
But it is that conversation needs to be had. It can't be a situation that a manager arrives in on a Monday morning and says, right, we're changing A, B, C, and D, and you have to just do it because I said so. There has to be, as you say, a journey. There has to be a conversation with all members of the team.
I think that's true in good management anyway, right? I mean, that's not a new idea. And that is partly contingent on organizational culture. So some organizational cultures are hierarchical and rule-based, and they actually work better when people might be happy about it, but in terms of how the organizational change functions, it has to come through kind of an order structure. So it really does depend a lot on the organization, the size of the organization, the type and level of change that's being made. But as a principle, having it discussed meaningfully so that people understand why a change is being made makes a lot of sense. And people also have the option to opt in or out of organizations. People do that all the time already. So that's not a new thing. That someone might say, this place has gone bats. They're all about the environment, and I think that's a load of nonsense. So I'm off somewhere else where we're free to burn oil and gas to our heart's content and pretend that it's not happening. And there are some people who think like that, clearly. So maybe there's, the ethos of an organization and the people who work there is a constantly evolving relationship, and people move all the time for all sorts of reasons. So we shouldn't be fearful of that either. Arguably, those organizations that look to adapting to the reality of climate change are making themselves more resilient for the future anyway. So it's not like they're weakening themselves. I actually think strengthening themselves.
Well, there is more than one meaning of sustainability when it comes to running a business, both from a practical longevity sense and the environment side of things. Well, Dr. Eoin Galavan, it has been an absolute pleasure talking through what is a major challenge for all of us as we move through to this next phase. Tell us about the two organisations again, and how can we find out more about them?
So the first one is the Psychological Society of Ireland special interest group called Addressing the Climate and Environmental Emergency, and you can find out about that on the PSI website. And the second is the Irish Doctors for the Environment group, which have their own website, recently established as a charity, and are doing absolutely brilliant work in advocating for the health impacts of climate change.
Well, thank you very much for your time and for joining us on Cut Through the Noise.
Thank you.